Welcome to the Stray Pointers podcast, where seemingly ordinary people join us for extraordinary discussions. You're listening to Season 2, Episode 4 of the Stray Pointers podcast. This episode was recorded on February 2nd, 2024. I'm your host, Jim Lawless. Please visit straypointers.com for more information about the show, including the show notes for this episode. Tonight, I'd like to welcome software engineer, musician, and BBS pioneer, digital man, Rob Swindell. Rob, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks. Glad to be here, Jim.
Hey, Rob, I wanted to start with your background in tech, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a computer tech. You know, if you were messing around with cars or electronics or things like that, what were some of your earliest, hobbies in tech?
BBSing honestly was one of my first hobbies in tech, or just gaming, having a home computer and, being able to like type in the games out of magazines. You'd type that basic code and maybe save it to a cassette tape if you were lucky, but otherwise you just turn off your Commodore and lose all the game progress, the game that you wrote, but you write another one tomorrow. So yeah, programming or gaming early on. Otherwise, tech stuff, I'm kind of into cameras, like I did a lot of stuff with security cameras, and I'm kind of an amateur videographer, fly drones, stuff like that, but that, we didn't really have too much in the way of high quality video with like remote control stuff,
Sure.
Back in the 80s, right?
Sure.
But yeah, always kind of been into remote control cars and planes and stuff like that too.
Okay. So tell me a little bit then about your first forays into the world of BBSs.
So I think, the first BBSs were actually from an Apple II computer, a 2 Plus, I think it was. It was my brother had traded or sold our Commodore and bought an Apple and had an Apple Cat modem. I think it was 1200 BPS, and used to connect to BBSs and other online. Back then you could like sort of war dial and find random businesses that had some kind of login that you would connect to over the phone. So it wasn't just BBSs, and there was other things like file transfer lines and chat only lines kind of thing, doing all that stuff. I think it was GBBS Pro was the BBS of choice back then on the Apple days, and so I called mostly Apple BBSs initially.
But you didn't have to suffer through 300 baud?
No, I don't recall using a 300 baud. I think our first one was 1200. I think it was the Apple Cat was a 1200 baud modem, if I recall correctly. And I think it had like a voice processor too. So like we could type, text, and it would, do text to speech, and you could crank call people and stuff with a fake voice.
Wow, what year would this have been?
Oh, that was probably like 83, 82,
Okay.
83, somewhere around there, maybe 84.
Okay. So how did you discover BBSs? How did you and your brother discover these?
It was a way to get games mainly. It was just a way to get free games or just socialize with people. I remember back then, getting in heated arguments, with people about, was Neil Peart or John Bonham the greater drummer, was an IBM PC or an Apple II the better computer to own, or a Commodore, all those kinds of arguments.
But were there ads in the newspaper, flyers at school or a supermarket or anything like that? How did you actually discover a BBS?
Yeah, I think there probably were for commercial BBSs at least, but we couldn't call long distance. We couldn't rack up a big phone bill, so it was like you find that first BBS and then you kind of go from there, right? It would typically have like a list of other BBSs, and then you just, sort of organically discover the web of BBSs back in the day. It wasn't like there was one master list really, or at least none that I could find. And the ones that were advertised like in magazines, like you mentioned, they're typically like pay BBSs, or maybe they would be a long distance call, so not usually practical for a 14-year-old kid.
Did you have, was there a BBS community? Did you guys have get-togethers outside of, calling up BBSs and things like that?
I've been to some BBS get-togethers. It's been a long, long time, and I met certainly, some individuals that, some of my longtime friends I met through BBSing. But yeah, I never like had big get-togethers for my own BBS. And I only remember like one or two pizza parties that I went to for others, and it's kind of a nerd fest, a lot of
Sure.
very introverted people, so not a whole lot of those.
Do you think that the BBSs brought out, made them extroverts while they were on the other end of a terminal program?
Yeah, I think people definitely acted very differently. Being a Sysop and being able to watch people chat and interact in real time, you kind of got an insight into how much people would pretend to be someone else, maybe a different gender, or just a totally different personality, or multiple personalities. It was not too uncommon to have people, log into a BBS as multiple different people, and even argue with themselves, or, just sort of early trolls, right? Trying to get other people all riled up and playing both sides of an argument.
So you mentioned being a sysop, and you said it the right way, sysops. I'm very happy about that. How did you transition from a BBS user to a sysop?
I think it was a natural progression to kind of want to have that control and creativity. So, some of my friends back in the early days were sysops, and I wasn't. And so it was like, you aspired to be, right? You needed to have your own phone line. You needed to have a computer that could be on all the time. You had to have, a fast enough modem. So I didn't run a BBS until I had a 2400 baud modem and an IBM PC. And even then, that wasn't like state of the art. You're still kind of getting people going, oh, why don't you have 9600 baud? Or, I think that was probably state of the art at the time. Or why aren't you running this software? You get a lot of creative or criticism as well.
Was there a reason that you didn't run it on your Apple II?
Well, for one, that was really my brother's computer, and he took it with him when he moved away.
Oh, okay.
And so I never really had the opportunity to run a BBS on the Apple. And it didn't have a hard drive. You had to run off floppies. And I had a friend that did run BBS on Apple back then, and that was a pretty major investment, in time and energy. And you had to have a lot of these floppy drives and even manually swap disks and stuff. And it looked like a lot of work. So yeah, I'm kind of glad I missed that part of the game.
Okay, so I understand your first experience running a BBS on your XT was through the terminal program Telex's host mode.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, Telex had its own scripting language, as a C-like language called Salt, and it came with a host script that was, pretty trivial to modify. It was not ANSI, it was not color, didn't do, extended ASCII characters or anything. And as I recall, I think it did have some very basic file transfers. So I think that was kind of what I focused on. I called it the Pirate's Cove, and just had some file transfers available, but it was just super basic. There was no like message networking or maybe primitive real-time chat, but no door game support, nothing that you would normally expect on a BBS. So it was a very temporary endeavor.
Yeah, Telex was one of the first terminal programs for MS-DOS that actually had Z modem built in, that didn't have to shell out to Omen Technologies driver for all that stuff. So I'm betting there was just a Z modem function or something like that in the Salt language.
Yeah, probably X, Y, and Z modem, and we also used like Procom Plus. I think was a big one around that same time. Later, Telemate, and all of those had integrated Z modem support. So it was pretty common around that time.
So what made you then move on to a formal BBS software?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, again, my friends had sort of moved on from Apple BBSs to IBM BBSs, and WWIV was the software of choice because you could get the source code. Um, and it was although it was commercial, it wasn't. There was a lot of piracy going on with the source code for it. So none of my friends had paid for it, and modifications were very prevalent. People would, do their own cosmetic things or features. And so, yeah, it seemed like the natural thing, like, oh, that's what you get. You get this WWIV source code. And then we started our own network. We called it DovNet because my friend's BBS was the Beast domain. So that's where the DO and DovNet, and then mine was Vertrauen. So those two together made Dove. And yeah, a few of us were running WWIV and we'd share mods. And I really wanted to run a multi-line BBS. So I started modifying WWIV to work better with multiple concurrent users and simultaneous lines, and do things like batch uploads. I think it didn't have batch upload support. I added that. But yeah, it's kind of the natural progression, although there were other BBS packages. Yeah, quickly became kind of part of that WWIV community.
Now, I'm curious, the name Vertrauen, what does that mean?
It's German for trust is what it translates to. And yeah, I at the time was playing in a band, and we chose that as a sort of the next name for the band. And the band really didn't do much. We never gigged with that name. We gigged with other names before that, but I really liked the name. It was unique. I think most important to me was just the likelihood or very low probability that another BBS had that same name. Because, it always bothered me if you pick a really great name you think is like, something super unique, like Pirates Cove, right? There's naturally going to be another Pirates Cove BBS,
Sure.
or maybe 20 of them.
Sure.
So I wanted a unique name, something that I didn't have to worry about conflict with.
So this predates Synchronet, but you said you were hacking multi-user support into I call it World War IV. I don't know
Yeah.
I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced, but you were hacking multi-user support into that. Tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about that. Was that did you have to like install multiple serial port cards, multiple serial cards in your PC? Do you have a digiboard? I don't understand necessarily how that support worked.
um I mean, I think in theory you could have done that. So the digiboard required its own driver. Later I learned more about digiboard. At the time, it was just basically I had two PCs. I had like my PC and then like a second one for the BBS, and I
Okay.
wanted to run a node on both.
Okay.
And they were networked together. I think at the time I was probably using NetWare version 2 or something. And so really, yeah, it was no special serial port on either, just a modem and a phone line for both. But I wanted them to have access to the same files, be able to chat between them, that kind of stuff. Message bases, concurrent access to message bases. But WWIV, especially at the time, was not designed for that. So there was a lot of corner cases and issues around database corruption and stuff. So eventually I got sick of chasing down those problems and trying to fix them all, and just started scratch with Synchronet. So that's really how Synchronet started. Was I wanted, a good multi-node BBS, and WWIV was the inspiration, but I soon started over.
Now Synchronet was written in C.
Yeah, it was a C project, C and a little bit of assembly. Really, like initially I did like inline C assembly, and then later a friend of mine who was also in that band Vertrauen, he was the keyboardist. He ended up writing like all the local console and remote serial console or remote serial routines in assembler, and he was really good at that. And when it became a commercial product, I paid him as well. So he was a contractor for the company for a while.
Did you use any third-party libraries for anything?
Certainly not for a long time. I mean, the closest thing to a third-party library was that assembly library that I had. Steve Deppie was his name. I had him write that, and or he volunteered initially. Right, it was just like a gift. But then, over time, as you ask for more and more features and support, like digiboard support was added at one point. I paid him to do that. But yeah, no like off the shelf library integration. All the database stuff I wrote from scratch. Just kind of learning how to do that, making my own mistakes. And I also wasn't super aware of like commercial libraries and stuff. I remember looking at the pkware library and considering integrating that for pkzip support, like internal, but it wasn't cheap to license, and I'm like, you can always shell out and run the utility, so that's how I integrated like archive support for zip files and such. And yeah, later, of course, nowadays we have several libraries integrated, but nothing commercial.
How were you learning all of this? I mean, you were trying to learn C at the
Yeah.
same time you're building a multi-user data file database.
Yeah.
How was that happening? Were you taking classes? Were you buying a lot of books?
Not a lot. I mean, I did have a mentor or two. Steve Deppy, could program in C and as well as assembly, and he gave me tips, and he would contribute some C code too. When you're first learning C, especially with WWIV, there was a lot of, or World War IV. They're both correct.
Mhm.
You would post a lot of stuff on message bases and talk with people, and you download patches, mods people called them, but you'd follow the instruction, and it would say, okay, open this file and insert these lines into this function, or change this line or whatever, and you kind of they're just going through the motions. But if you do something wrong, then you get a syntax error, and you're like, oh, then you have to kind of learn a little bit about the languages to resolve that issue. Pretty manual process of integrating other people's changes. Taught you a little bit about the language. Now, the code base, all props to Wayne Bell. The code was not a great starting point to learn the language from, but it was a way to at least, get exposed to it and start getting familiar with the tools, the syntax, the problems with like multi-user stuff. I mean, that a lot of them you don't discover until you get enough phone lines and enough simultaneous users to go, oh, I see, it's actually a problem when you have 3 people doing that, but 2 is not a problem. It's 3 is the magic number, or maybe it's 20, whatever that threshold where things start to fall apart, you kind of discover over time.
Can you tell me a little bit about the features that grew into the MS-DOS version of Synchronet that you feel separated it from the other BBSs out there, made it stand out?
Yeah, initially it was very file focused. Like my BBS was very much a file transfer BBS, and it was really, my main motivation for running a BBS was to kind of collect and distribute files, for quite a while. And then when more and more people started, other sysops were running it, right? Then they'd say, oh, well, I want FidoNet support, or I want support for Q2BK packets, or what. And I was like, I don't even know what that is. I didn't really use like too many of those public domain, like PC board, Wildcat systems too thoroughly to get too familiar with that stuff. So yeah, that's when I don't know, door games was another major focus. So I'd say like in initial versions, it was like multi-node chat, being able to chat between the in real time between the nodes of the BBS. So you can actually see each other type, making typing mistakes and stuff, split screen, and then like multi-line where it's interleaved lines of text, which is a pretty typical multi-person chat. And then supporting door games. Those are all like a lot of different drop file support. Supporting people running like the same doors if they supported that at the same time. Chasing down those issues. The communications, because some doors would use like they'd use, back then it was like int29, like a DOS interrupt for communicating with the screen basically, but you'd intercept that and send that over the modem. That's kind of how WWIV native chains, they called them, worked. But more traditional BBS door games would use a fossil driver. So then you'd have to like maybe run a fossil driver either before or after the BBS loads, depending on what you want to support as far as communication hardware. And anyway, those were all like areas of big focus at the time. And then it really got into messaging more later, like as I got more into FidoNet and Q2BK I mentioned. There was a Sysop, an early commercial Synchronet Sysop in Las Vegas. I think it was called Las Vegas Playground. And he's the one that queued me into networking via Q2BK packets, because initially I added Q2BK support for offline readers. So you could SLMR and other readers like that. You could just download a packet and respond to messages offline and then upload your responses. And save time. You're not connected very long, and you can kind of collect all the messages on your machine and stuff. But being able to do message networking between BBSs using that same packet technology was attractive to me. It's like, oh, I can reuse all this code that I put into the BBS for networking, and I don't have to implement WWIV-net support, because that was something that Wayne held close to his chest. I think he never release the source code to parts of the networking stuff, and it took quite a while before that all became more commonly known and supported in other BBSs. So it wasn't an open standard like FidoNet. So QWK-net, FidoNet, and then later I actually paid for the license to implement support for PostLink. That was what RelayNet and Rime used. PostLink technology. And so we had to write something called a universal text interface driver, a UTI driver. It makes me think of urinary tract infection, but it was actually, this spec, pretty well written, to convert all your messages to this intermediate text format when you're importing and exporting. And, so I had that support, but I don't think a lot of people used it. I don't think it got much traction.
So then at some point you decided to sell Synchronet. You had your own instances of Synchronet. Did other people run Synchronet for a little while, and then you thought maybe there was a market here? How did selling it come about?
Yeah, the initial stuff, like demand wise, was people really wanting the source code. And back then, especially, open source wasn't even a term. Like, people didn't really talk about it. Like shareware, maybe, yeah, freeware, but source code, like you don't expect other people to build your stuff. But I did have sysops that are like, I want your source code. And I was like, okay, how about $200? So I really wasn't planning on selling it, but more like sort of acquiesced to the demand, and said, okay, I'll give it to you for $200. So there's a few like early sysops like that really just wanted to modify it and I don't know, just own the code, I guess. But I think it was around that time, it was just a couple of years into it, right? So really before like FidoNet and a lot of those advancements I just talked about, it was mainly file transfers, multi-node chat, certainly had message bases and all that, but it wasn't heavily networking focused.
How much did you sell it for initially? Do you remember?
Oh, I mean, I think we advertised like a 2-line version for like $50 or something, when it was like, when I'm talking about selling like the executables, not the source code.
Yes.
And then once it becomes a commercial product, like you're depending on it for your livelihood, you don't sell source code anymore because you're worried that somebody's going to take your source code and create a competing product. So the whole source code thing was kind of short-lived. And then, it ranged from like 59 or 49 to $100 around there for like a 1-2 node license, up to like 215 nodes for like $300, I think, was kind of the price range. We experimented. My brother was really the big inspiration around that time. He was the one that was like discovered the magazines like Boardwatch and BBS Callers Digest. It later changed its names to BBS Magazine. But he was like, hey man, I'll design the ads. I'll front you the money to advertise. I really think we could sell your BBS software commercially. And so he was the inspiration, the motivation. So I think around that same time I was between jobs and I'm like, okay, I'll do it. I'll throw all my time and energy into this thing. And then, you start getting the discussions, phone calls, people logging in your BBS and considering it as an alternative to other commercial products. And that with all these demands like Digiboard or things I wasn't familiar with. And FidoNet even, I'd heard of it, but I wasn't really into it. And I was like, okay, I'll learn what that is. I'll start reading the specs and, implement it. And it was stuff to do.
How much of your time was focused on the engineering versus did some of that then did you have to learn how to run a business?
Yeah, I did. I mean, in the beginning, yeah, I could spend most of the time on the actual coding part, and then some tech support, some sales. But yeah, as a balance, I mean, over time, I ended up hiring people, both for sales, support, and then also writing code. And I ended up spending most of my time on the phone or on the keyboard. I remember I think it was 4 hours a day, and I kind of limited myself to 4 hours in just tech support, like just answering messages on message basis. Um, and now it's like I look forward to getting questions, but back then it was a real drag after a while because you're like, man, I want to get to the features and the new stuff, and answering just all these support questions was a big drag. So I was always looking for ways to sort of automate that, or make a better manual or a better voicemail system where people could find answers in real time, and I wouldn't take me answering all the questions. But never really, I mean, the internet was really what I needed, right? I needed the internet and a wiki, and a community of people that also knew how to support it. And yeah, just didn't have those things at the time.
So you mentioned Boardwatch magazine. Did you ever interact with Jack Rickard?
I don't know if I interacted with him in person. I don't think so. I know that he ran that convention, one BBS Con, and we had a booth there in '93, I think it was. Spent a lot of money and didn't make a lot of sales. Didn't get any press in his magazine as a result. And that was kind of a bummer because we spent a lot of money and had a lot of excitement, especially around this big blimp. You maybe the story. My brother had this giant Synchronet blimp made, and we hung it over our booth, and it was great. You couldn't stand anywhere in that convention hall and not see the blimp, but yet somehow they published all these pictures of the convention, all the booths, and managed to crop out the blimp in every one of them. So there was not a single picture of the blimp in the magazine, which was really frustrating. And then, of course, when somebody wrote into Jack and asked him, well, hey, why don't you talk more about Synchronet at, I hear they were at one BBS Con, and he said, yeah, nobody was there at their booth when I went to talk to them. And I was like, what? I was there the whole time. Like, I didn't go to any of the talks, which I wish I had. I think they had Vincent Cerf there that year as well. I did meet John Dvorak, though. He came to the booth, but Jack never came to the booth, so that was a lie.
That's interesting. I was curious because if you flew under Jack's radar, that might have been okay, because if Jack took note of you, he may have, written something about you in his magazine was his pulpit for doing
Yeah,
that a lot of times for people who had wronged him. So I
he was a
was
good
curious
writer, though.
about that.
I liked reading his stuff, and kind of similar to John Dvorak in that way too, right? Kind of that grumpy tech writer style, which I enjoyed reading. So I don't know. They say there's no such thing as bad press, so maybe even him bitching about my software would have been better than nothing.
Sure. Now you were adding features to Synchronet at this time. You added a scripting language called Baha. Were you taking any formal classes, or were you, again, as this is all self-taught, self-acquired knowledge on learning how to write P code compilers and things like that?
So I did take some college classes around programming, but they were pretty remedial, and I was already more advanced than what the courses were teaching. So I didn't really learn a lot in those courses. That's not to say I couldn't have. Like, if I had stayed with it and gotten more and more advanced, in the courses, the course levels, I certainly would have had plenty to learn. But I just didn't stay with it. Anyway, but yeah, the whole Baja thing was really just a way to sort of tokenize the language into a bytecode. It's not the compiler in a sense like what a C++ compiler is. I wasn't compiling to machine code or doing even really complex, flow control, or the more advanced like data structures and stuff. Is very simple, right? It only had like integer, numbers, and strings. Those are the only two data types. Nothing abstract or compound. No floating point math. Very, very basic. And the inspiration of the syntax really kind of came from a combination of basic and assembler. I know it seems like opposite ends of the spectrum, but I did know how to program an assembler a little bit, and I knew basic as well. Some parts were C as well, like the whole formatting of strings was taken from C. So it's kind of a combination of those three languages, just put together very haphazardly.
So when did the dial-up BBS culture, when did that end? When did your BBS start going offline?
Oh, I mean, for the business, it was around 95 that things really, really tailed off. Like I remember 94 was a pretty good year commercially, maybe the peak actually. Uh, and I don't know if it was for all of the industry, but for just for myself in that business, it was 94 was a pretty good year, but 95 was really bad. And that's when I was like, hey, I need to get a job. I need to do something else for income now. And, started telling the folks that worked for me that I couldn't employ them anymore, which is really a bad, sad part of that job. But I didn't turn off my phone lines until 97, I think it was. And I had, because you'd built up, I had, I don't know, there's a video somewhere on YouTube as well. Like I had my kitchen like dedicated to the BBS, had racks with all the computers, and I had Planet Connect satellite and a machine dedicated to churning that, and a file server, and all that stuff. Machines for duplicating floppy disks for selling Synchronet. Um, and I had 8 phone lines. I don't think all of 8 of them for the BBS. I think maybe one of the 2 of those is a voice line as well. But um, it was expensive. And when you stop getting phone calls and then they tell you, you need to give us a big deposit, or we're not going to, renew your phone lines or turn them back on or whatever the case was. I was like, well, but if I turn them off, you'll give me back my deposit. Like they were already holding like, I don't know, $1,000 or something.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, I'll take the money and turn off the BBS, because it just wasn't getting a whole lot of calls at that point. So about 97.
Okay. Now, in the early 2000s, I think it was Jason Scott made his famous, at least in the tech community, his famous set of films that was called the BBS Documentary, and
Yeah.
you were featured there. I know on your YouTube channel you've got the first hour of interview with Jason, and the links to that will be in the show notes for this episode. But how did that come about? Did Jason contact you? Did he send out a call for participation that you saw? How did you two communicate and get together for that interview?
Yeah, again, I need to give credit to my brother Mike. He was the one that heard about Jason was doing that documentary. I don't know how he came across it online or something, and he reached out to Jason and said, "Hey, you need to interview my brother because he's still totally into this BBSing thing and Synchronet." And I don't know that Jason knew of Synchronet before that. So he kind of put me on his calendar and decided, oh, when I go to California, I'll make my way to Southern California and interview this guy. And I think we had some email exchanges, told him a little bit about my history, WBIV, and that kind of thing. So he definitely had done his homework by the time I talked to him. And I think it was 2002. And yeah, eventually I got the entire unedited interview with myself. I think it's the entire interview, and I did put that on the YouTube channel. But yeah, my bits in his documentary were pretty small. There was like a little bit in like the part pay, like when you talk about commercialization and selling BBS software or running a pay BBS. That whole chapter, there's a little bit of myself in there, but otherwise, I wasn't really prominent or featured, I don't think, in his documentary.
When did Synchronet then rise from the ashes and start to harmonize with the internet and web and telnet access and that sort of thing?
Yeah, that was about 1999. I think it was 99 that I was working. My day job was doing internet protocols and multi-threaded stuff, and I was thinking, I could take sort of the core logic of that DOS BBS and turn that into a multi-threaded program and make it a telnet server. And I was vaguely aware that people did still telnet to BBSs. I remember there was a vFossil, virtual fossil thing for OS2 that I think that was the popular way to get telnet access to a BBS, at least in the late 90s there. And so I was thinking, I could do something similar for Windows. I didn't really want to virtualize a COM port. I later did, but initially it was just a telnet server. Just make it so you use a telnet client and you connect directly to it. Microsoft had their telnet.exe, which was very, very basic in Windows 95 or 98. and they also had Hyperterminal, which was, I think, it was a GUI terminal that supported several protocols, but it also did telnet and ANSI BBS interface. So it was pretty decent as a BBS client. That was the inspiration. And then, of course, it was like, okay, for file transfers, we will support the sort of historic XYZ modem, but also do FTP. And that was probably my first sort of traditional internet protocol in addition to telnet.
When did you had a web-based interface to this as well, did you not?
Yeah, the web server came later, and the other major contributor to Synchronet is Stephen Hurd. He goes by the alias Deuce, and he wrote the web server. He's done a whole bunch of other stuff too, like he did all the TLS and SSH stuff. He's contributed to IRC client. More recently he's been working on an SFTP server. But yeah, he's done a whole bunch of stuff for Synchronet, and he's the one that created SyncTerm. Like that's his project. So he wanted a dedicated BBS client that was really made for ANSI BBS use, and not something that was one of Microsoft's or somebody else's repurposed telnet client.
Yeah, that's a great client too, and it's I've run it on Windows and I've run the Mac OS version, and I really like both of them. But that's recommended basically for any of those Windows, Mac, and I would assume Linux.
Yeah, Linux, FreeBSD. He's a big FreeBSD proponent and user, so this is definitely a FreeBSD build of it as well.
Yep. So, how many operating systems does Synchronet run on now? The current version.
The primary supported ones are Windows and Linux. FreeBSD definitely supported as well, just because Deuce runs FreeBSD, and maybe a few other sysops. There's still a couple holdouts that run maybe the OS2 version, but there's no like new commits to that whole branch. The whole version 2 branch, is kind of a dead end. If there's some critical security fix or something, I suppose I could always patch it, but yeah, it's primarily Windows NT based versions of Windows, so not Windows 98 or 95 or ME. Those I supported at one time, but don't any longer. The new versions only work on pretty much Windows XP and later, and server flavors of Windows.
So this is all open source now.
Oh yeah. It's been open source since since '99, when I sort of revived it, and I was like, there's no reason to try to make any money on this. Nobody's going to buy this kind of software. It's just a fun project, and that's how I got Stephen involved. He wanted to port it to, back then I think it was FreeBSD, and he wrote some Perl utilities and stuff for it, and he knew what to do to make a web server for it. I sort of vaguely knew, but he was super motivated and wanted to make the web server. So that's pretty much his project, is the web server, and I've certainly contributed to that part of it too, but it's primarily him.
Was this your first major open source effort, or had you done open source development before?
No, this is it. Yeah, this is my first one, and really only one. I contribute to others, but Synchronet is such a big project now, with so many different components. It's got its own FidoNet mailer and traditional internet mail server, and it's got an IRC daemon. And
is FidoNet still around?
FidoNet, oh yeah, FidoNet's still around. It's a fraction of the size, but and the protocols have changed. There's something called BinkP, or Binkley Daemon Protocol, I think is what that stands for, but that's pretty much the main method of moving files and packets around FidoNet these days.
How big is the presence of Synchronet now? How many people are running Synchronet nodes?
I don't know the exact count. There's a list. I could look. It's probably around 200 that are in the list. And not everybody that installs it is in that list. And then they expire, if they're not updated within, 90 days or so, then they kind of roll off and disappear. So I don't keep closely on track as far as like statistics goes, as the number of installs, but usually hovers around 200 BBSs running Synchronet at any given time.
Great. What's on the horizon now for Rob Swindell?
Well, in BBS land, I'm kind of got late around to this game was internationalization and supporting other languages besides U.S. English in other character sets. We do support UTF-8, and that's the modern way to do non-American character sets. But maybe supporting some other popular code pages. You probably are aware that we have a JavaScript engine integrated in
Oh,
Synchronet.
yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's really the modern replacement for Baja. Baja, although it's still supported, is certainly not recommended. Like everything that I ever wrote in Baja has been translated to JavaScript these days.
So we didn't really cover it, but Baja and your current incarnation of JavaScript, that's really for customizing the look and feel and things of the BBS, is it not? So that, well, it might be a moot point now that the source is entirely open, but in the day, even when you were selling copies, that was so that the host of the BBS could kind of customize the look and behaviors. Yes.
Yeah, certainly Baja, that was its main purpose, was writing what we called command shells. And that's the whole thing that drives your menus and your command key interface to the terminal server. We didn't call it a terminal server back in the day, right? It was just a BBS. But that whole thing that displays files and has prompts and interacts with the users, that's all scripted. Back in the day it was Baja. Now it's all JavaScript. And we also use it to drive a lot of the servers. So like the IRC daemons all written in JavaScript. There's an NTP server for the Usenet protocol, and many others. And those are all written in JavaScript as well. Sort of the dynamic HTML and CSS generation is all done in server-side JavaScript. So it's funny, we were doing server-side JavaScript for like dynamic FTP indexes, so you could get HTML FTP interface that was dynamically generated, and this is all long before like Node.js or the modern
Sure.
popular way of doing server-side JavaScript. And I was like, hey, I've got this JavaScript engine from Mozilla. It's open source, and integrating that into Synchronet, and then just looking at all the ways that you could then make quick and dirty servers or servlets with it. Was a fun thing to do, and we still do.
Great. Is there anything we didn't cover that we should have?
Games are a popular thing. I haven't written a whole lot of games. I originally wrote games for Synchronet in C, but more recently wrote a Minesweeper game in JavaScript. And there's a lot of cool newer, I say newer, within the last 10 years, right? But games written for Synchronet in JavaScript, and the idea that somebody could modify those or learn from those and make their own. We have a Lord clone, Legend of the Red Dragon clone, and Lord 2 and Trade Wars, basically play alike, and they use the same data files and stuff. But those are all written in JavaScript.
Were those pretty big attractions to your BBS back when you were hosting the MS-DOS Synchronet instances?
Oh yeah, door games are always popular. Though I don't know that the ones that I wrote like blackjack, like multiplayer blackjack, so that's not too. I'd say the most popular one I wrote was Matchmaker Door. One time I had like 4,000 people in that Matchmaker database, and some people even got married when they met through
really?
this network. Wow. Matchmaker. Yeah. And back then I had like JPEG images that you could see and share. And this is, before the web and internet. Wow. Matchmaking was all the rage. So, but not a game. Anyway, yeah, it was popular. Most popular use of my BBS at any time was file transfers. I just was so into that, sharing like pirated files initially, and then it was image files, and then it was the actual like BBS related files, getting whether it was the latest version of Synchronet or door games or whatever, but just having and hosting all those CD-ROMs that had all the BBS related files on them. That was super popular at the time. Now, of course, you can find all that stuff on the web really easily.
Sure. Well, Rob, I thank you for your time tonight. This has been a lot of fun.
All right.
Thank
Jim,
you.
it was very nice meeting you and talking with you. And Lawless is your real last name?
That is. And I could tell you stories about my first BBS experiences. There were pirate boards that were prevalent back in the day and it was a rather serious board, and I signed on that one with my real name.
Yeah.
And I know the Sysops to this day. I'm trying to get them on the show too. But there was a debate over whether or not this was a pirate alias, some script kid coming on to their BBS. But yeah, Lawless is my given
I could
last
see
name.
that. Yeah. Are you a Wasp fan? You know Blackie Lawless?
I know of Blackie Lawless.
Yeah.
I am not a Wasp fan. Lucy's not my cousin. None of
Okay.
that stuff.
All right.
Um,
I was thinking we should start a law firm. We'd be Swindell and Lawless.
I was I had to watch some of your videos so I could figure out how to pronounce your last name properly.
Okay.
I have to do that a bit because I couldn't really tell, and then I heard it on like your intro YouTube video. I heard your self-introduction, so that helped me out quite a bit.
All right. Cool.
My actual handle on BBS's back in the day in the mid 80s was syntax error, and it was spelled wrong. It was
Oh, that's right.
CINTAKSAIRER,
Okay.
and that's my BBS persona.
It's a good one. Yeah, it's a good one.
All right. Well, thanks again, Rob. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Let's do this again soon. Take care.